Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this is another instalment in our ongoing deep dive into Mystic Knights of Tir Na Nog, the fantasy adventure series set in Pretend Ireland, made by Saban Entertainment, most famous for producing Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. This is episode 14, Aideen and the Stone Princess. Before we get into that, I have the pleasant duty to thank some new patrons. These are kind souls who've gone to patreon.com/HJDoom and pledged as little as £1 to support my nonsense and keep this show on the air and ad-free. There's a bunch of bonus stuff that all patrons get access to when they pledge, a whole collection of adventure game books and RPGs that I've written over the years. That's quite the deal for as little as £1. Any and all support is gratefully appreciated, and so I am delighted to be able to thank Eddie and DGN for their generosity. Thanks a lot, guys, from the bottom of my heart. The last couple of episodes were all about making Tyrone, the three-headed dragon, into a major threat, something they broadly managed with the usual caveats about Mystic Knight's ability to snatch bathos from the jaws of excitement. I found this follow-up particularly interesting in that it's essentially a cocktail episode, one that takes a bunch of things we've seen before and then muddles them up with a couple of new ingredients to make something that is more, perhaps, than the sum of its parts. One thing I do really like about it is that it's paced a little differently. It's still stuffed to the gills with plot, but it has rather more space to breathe than in some episodes, which I think is down to having its biggest action set piece take place in the middle of the story rather than at one end. It opens in positively relaxed fashion, with the Mystic Knights enjoying some downtime in Kells castle. In practice, this means Rohan and Angus having a wrestling match, while Ivar watches and makes catty comments from nearby. Ivar isn't the only one watching, as one of Queen Maeve's fairy spies, a boggart, is also keeping an eye on the action. The boggarts are by far the best of Maeve's collection of little folk, because they can teleport, but only by also teleporting a bunch of slime to the relevant location, which is exactly the sort of gross detail I would have loved as a kid. I was weirdly obsessed with the He-Man slime pit set, which allowed you to douse your He-Man action figures in green goop. You could probably have done the same to your sister's troll dolls, which makes it very helpful that I'd grown out of that sort of thing by the time she was old enough to have the kind of toys that could have ended up with horrible matted dreadlocks after a session in the slime pit. But I digress. We're meant to assume that the boggart is spying on the castle for reasons of strategy, but I like to think it might just be a big wrestling fan. If so, it's going to have been pretty disappointed with the in-ring action Angus and Rohan are providing. We get a fair amount of circling, a little taunting, and a shove here and there, and then Rohan grabs Angus round the waist and pulls him off his feet. It looks like he's about to execute some kind of primitive power slam, or maybe some kind of suplex variant, but instead he just puts Angus carefully back down on his feet, and then Angus picks Rohan up and does exactly the same thing. It's like watching two boxers wind up punches and then pivot at the last moment into a hearty handshake. Basically, I don't think anyone was willing to come up with a version of wrestling that could satisfy the competing demands of looking like an actual fight and being safe enough for the actors to do it instead of stunt doubles. So what we get is the combat equivalent of when you think you're about to do a massive sneeze, and you do a couple of really big in-breaths, only for the actual result to be so quiet that it would be perfectly acceptable in a library for mice with anxiety disorders. After several minutes of extremely safe grappling and one carefully executed forward roll, the Princess Deidre rocks up and cheerfully announces that she'll fight the winner. This is the cue for Angus and Rohan to step it up a gear, since they're both quite horny and Deidre is the only adult woman they actually know, and they both relish the chance to pick her up and put her down again a couple of times in the name of sharpening their combat skills. Angus makes a headlong dive, and Rohan executes a neat trip that sends Angus flying into some suspiciously soft sacks. Whoever owns those sacks is going to be furious when they open them and discover their blancmange has been bruised. It's a nice little character moment contrasting Angus's headstrong approach to the world with Rowan's more considered demeanour. With victory achieved, Rohan wanders over to Deidre in order to claim the honour of fighting a woman half his size. Unfortunately for him, Aideen the fairy is also watching and is not at all happy with the idea of him using violence to flirt with the princess, because Aideen has a very strong crush on Rohan herself and is both possessive and jealous, especially where Deidre is concerned. So when Rohan approaches the princess, Aideen casts a quick spell that makes Rohan literally weak at the knees, and that causes him to collapse to his hands and knees in front of Deidre. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you had, long pause, fallen for me, Rohan, says Deidre, which is to quips as marshmallows are to lumps of sandstone. They're the same basic shape and colour, but you're not going to be able to build a barn out of them. Aideen tells Rohan that Deidre doesn't recognise a great hero when she sees one, but she, being much, 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 much hornier than Deidre, does. Rohan ignores Aideen, too focused on catching up with Deidre, Angus and Ivar, and this doesn't go down at all well with Aideen, which strongly suggests we're about to see a version of Fatal Attraction suitable for the under-10s. You'll be amazed what the under-10 version of Boiling a Family Pet shakes out to be. By the way, Fatal Attraction is well worth a watch in the 21st century. It hasn't aged especially well in some respects, but it's a fascinating insight into the anxieties of powerful men who cheat on their wives, and Glenn Close gives a super committed performance that imbues her character with a lot more layers than the script is prepared to give her. All of this has been carefully observed by the boggart, who jumps over the parapet of the castle walls to head back to his mistress with a delightful little ho-ho-ho cry that raised a chuckle from me in response. This is a boggart who absolutely loves being a boggart. He's high on life and slime, and that's hard not to find endearing. One person who doesn't find snot-covered rod of Ivra endearing turns out to be General Talk, because we now cut to Temra Castle, where the boggart is cowering under a table while Queen Maeve's chief minion berates him and stamps in one of the puddles of slime, calling the boggart a witless fool for having come back with such poor intelligence, as a silly little fairy being jealous of the princess. He's genuinely furious, and it's a good opportunity for the script to show that he's a hot-headed bully, since neither he nor Maeve will feature particularly strongly in this episode. Speaking of Maeve, she is a little more upbeat about the news the boggart brings. She says that any information can be turned to your advantage if you know how, and Talk grudgingly agrees, which is good news for the boggart, who's now not going to get stamped on. We've got most of the pieces in place for the episode, and it's now just a question of seeing how they play out. The first thing that happens is Aideen decides to go on a visitation to Tir na Nog, the subterranean kingdom of the little people. King Finvara isn't in this episode, so instead of his court, we get some fairies doing lacklustre folk dancing in an otherwise empty cave set. Tir na Nog gets more dystopian every time we see it. Imagine if dancing in a circle in a dimly lit cave was your only form of recreation. Now imagine you're doing it with the fixed and vacant grin of an imbecile in the grips of amphetamine psychosis, and you'll have some idea as to how this plays out. The dancing goes on for way longer than it needs to as well, as if to really hammer home the horror of this underground realm. I guess they had the folk dancers for the afternoon and they were going to get their money's worth out of them one way or another. One fairy, an older woman with hair like Robert Smith of The Cure gave up backconing his barnet after about 10 minutes, isn't taking part in the dancing, and instead takes Aideen to task for being miserable when that's apparently not allowed in Tir na Nog, despite it being one of the few places in the universe more naturally dour than Bedford bus station at 10 PM on a Wednesday night. At least when I was regularly spending time in Bedford bus station late at night, no one was expecting me to do it with a smile on my face, least of all the residents of Bedford themselves. The older fairy quickly seems to divine that what's going on with Aideen relates to a man, and Aideen in turn confesses that it is a man, but it's more important that she's jealous of a princess. It just so happens that this helpful older lady with mad hair and a faintly sinister mien has exactly the solution to hand, in the shape of a comically oversized bottle of magical dust. It's a genuinely massive bottle for a fairy, clearly intended to convey that this is something that would be a handy little container for someone of larger stature. It would fit very neatly in the hand of a full-size Irish lady with a penchant for eyeshadow and summoning low-quality CGI monsters, to take just a random example. The scary fairy lady tells Aideen that sprinkling the contents of the very large but also very small bottle on the princess will make the boys lose all interest in her. Aideen seems unsure, but is convinced when the scary lady insists that the contents of the large small bottle are completely harmless. She takes the large small bottle and flies away as the fairy lady smiles in a way not calculated to inspire confidence in her motives. Meanwhile, Rohan and Angus have moved on from arm, leg and torso wrestling to the much purer sport of just arm wrestling. This is once again in order to impress Deidre, who does seem like she's at least theoretically game for the idea of jumping into bed with whoever's got the most well-developed wanking muscle. Aideen attempts to insinuate herself into the action, but everyone ignores her, which is a bit mean, to be fair. Rohan even flaps his hand at her like she's some kind of aggravating mosquito, which feels very harsh to do to a literal sentient being, even one as irritating as Aideen. The most important plot point is that the latest snub causes Aideen to finally decide to douse Deidre with the contents of the large small bottle she's been carrying. The most important production point is it turns out that it's possible to shoot an arm wrestling contest badly. I feel like a normal director, a normal basic run-of-the-mill director, would get that the key element you want to have in frame during an arm wrestling contest is the arm of the competitors. Not so with Kevin Barker. He reckons that all you need to see is the top of someone's knuckles and people will be able to infer what's going on from the facial expressions. Even when he does put the arms in shot, he somehow manages to make it look rubbish. Also, he apparently thinks that what people mostly do when they're arm wrestling is laugh, as Rohan and Angus are cackling like hyenas for the entire duration of the bout. Rohan wins because of course he does, and Deidre reacts to his boastful remarks at the conclusion of the bout with a little withering sarcasm, calling him my hero with the same kind of scorn usually reserved for 3D Sonic games. It doesn't appear that the magical dust has done anything to Deidre immediately, but what has definitely happened is that the castle is under attack. We know this because Ivar, so far absent from this scene, runs in and shouts, "The castle! It's under attack!" While Aideen fumes about the low-quality magic the fairy was peddling, the forces of Temra have somehow managed to launch a massive assault on the castle of Kells without anyone noticing. I don't know if you've ever tried to sneak up on a building with 200 or so close friends and a collection of siege weapons, but it's quite the challenge. One of the things about castles is that they've got big high walls and they're often on a hill. When you've got big high walls and you're on a hill, one of the things you'll immediately notice is that you can see quite a long way in all directions. This isn't an accident of castle design, more of a feature designed to make it a lot harder for 200 people and their siege weapons to suddenly pop up unannounced. Having a selection of bored but passably alert people standing in towers and looking at things was very much the Ring doorbell of the Middle Ages, with the added advantage that you can fire crossbow bolts at cold callers rather than simply cowering behind the sofa and waiting for them to go away. Regardless, the forces of Temra have somehow managed to get themselves a battering ram and a selection of rickety siege ladders right up to the walls of Kells Castle under the noses of the defenders. What we get is a rather enjoyable battle sequence, which does a great job of strongly implying that people have been badly injured or killed without ever actually showing anyone getting badly injured or killed. It's a lovely bit of visual sleight of hand and definitely shows the director at his best. We get shots of the Temra soldiers scurrying up ladders, scenes of the warriors of Kells flinging spears at unseen targets, and even a vat of cold water being tipped down onto the attackers in a way that visually resembles the old boiling oil trick. My favourite bit is when the Temra soldiers break open the gate with their battering ram and then run over the Kells soldier who was standing behind the gate. He gets biffed in the chest by the battering ram and goes down like it was a Goldberg spear in 1998. It's wonderful. With the warriors of Temra now inside the walls, things devolve into a melee, which mostly involves warriors up on the walls being knocked off, which is a cool visual because it looks exactly like someone plunging to their death after being stabbed, but technically you've not seen them be actually hit with a sword and they could have landed in some straw or something and been absolutely fine. It's a bit of a stretch to assume that all 30 of these people we see falling off walls will be absolutely fine, but it is a formal possibility, and that's the important thing. It's a bit like watching a recent Minoru Suzuki match, in that he is a master of leaving you with the feeling that you've just watched a brutal wrestling encounter, despite the fact that when you watch it back, he's actually done very little wrestling for the entire runtime. The other thing the battle is doing well is showing off Deidre's fighting skills. She is an engine of carefully implied destruction in this ruck, using her air crossbow and a combination of kicks to take out enemy warriors left, right and centre, right up until the point where she suddenly turns to stone, which understandably curtails her rampage considerably. We do also get some footage of the other knights fighting, but it's Deidre who is the star turn here. And it's a clever bit of visual storytelling, because showing Deidre kicking ass and taking names usefully highlights how much weaker the Mystic Knights are without her around, and that will become useful later in the story when they're going to have to face the challenges as a trio rather than a quartet. And it also generously gives actress Lisa Dwan something cool to do in an episode where she'll be mostly absent due to statue. And if there's kids watching who like Deidre best, it gives them a chance to see her doing her stuff in order to take the sting out of her absence later. It's a win all round, basically. The best fights tell stories or reveal character through the combat, but that's often a challenge in an episodic kids' TV show, so it's worth calling out when they get it right, and this is absolutely one of those times. The good news is she gets turned to stone at the exact moment that the forces of Temra decide they've had enough falling off things and turn to their core competency, which is downing weapons and running for the hills at the first sign of trouble. The day is saved, and everyone is in a very good mood, what with still being alive, until Ivar spots that Deidre has been turned to stone. The fairy lady has theoretically delivered on her promise to stop the boys obsessing over Deidre with this neat trick, although given the apparent paucity of female company on the island, I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see one or both of them creeping up on the statue with a masonry drill and a big barrel of lube. King Conovar pops up to be surprised and sad, and this is the cue for Maeve to materialise on the battlements next to the statue, do an evil laugh, and push it off the walkway to plummet down into the courtyard below. I'll admit that for a single, solitary moment, I thought the statue was going to be smashed into 1,000 pieces, but of course it is completely fine. What's a bit odd about this scene is that just as Maeve is delivering her parting words before teleporting away, a boggart appears on one of the crenellations in the battlements and just sits there wetly. It's a very odd visual, but it does serve a purpose, because following Maeve's magical departure, the boggart transforms itself back into the friendly but scary fairy lady who first gave Aideen the bottle of dust that has turned Deidre to stone. Aideen realises she's been tricked and done something terrible, which the boggart lady finds absolutely hilarious. We've now got the episode fully set up, and it's interesting that it's taken more than 9 minutes to get to this point. That is a very slow build by the standards of Mystic Knights, and I think it's something that helps this episode feel quite fresh and different. If you wanted to take a more typical Mystic Knights approach to this episode, you would have opened with the battle and seen some kind of magical spell turn Deidre into a statue inside the first couple of minutes. And that would have had the advantage of leaving 3/4 of the episode to spend on actually resolving the crisis, rather than the roughly half an episode we get this time. It's going to make for a fairly hurried resolution doing it this way, but I don't mind in the least, because it does mess with the formula a bit. Next, we're in the chambers of Cahad the Druid, and King Conovar is urging him to use his own magic to restore his beloved daughter. Cahad tries a few powders and succeeds in briefly restoring Deirdre's head, but it's only for a few moments and she quickly reverts to stone. Conovar does what powerful people always do, which is then to repeatedly insist that someone do something to fix the situation without specifying any kind of solution. Cahad, who is clearly used to this sort of thing, calmly tells the king that the spell is beyond his power to break. It is a spell of Maeve, and only Maeve's magic can break it. King Conovar wonders how Maeve could have got so close to Deidre, and Rohan says that he thinks she used a black-hearted spy to do her dirty work, and everyone agrees that this spy, whoever they were, must be an unfathomably awful piece of shit. Just an absolute nightmare who probably drowns puppies and still has a Twitter account. We cut to Aideen looking understandably a bit perturbed by this turn of events. It's a good scene. We, the audience, know something that the characters don't, and that gives the script a chance to then have them do some emoting instead of needing to relentlessly drive the story forward with exposition. Aideen flies away, and it's really not clear what she's got in mind, which does generate some intrigue. We now cut to General Talk telling Queen Maeve that now is the perfect time to attack Kells when they are all demoralised from the princess being turned to stone. Actually, the perfect time to attack when Kells was demoralised from the princess being turned to stone was just a couple of scenes ago when they'd already done the hard work of breaking into the castle and Deidre had literally just been turned into a statue in front of them. However, I will accept that this is absolutely the second best time to attack Kells when they're all demoralised from the princess being turned to stone. Maeve doesn't appreciate talk stating the obvious, and she wants to do more than simply win a battle. She wants to completely destroy Kells, and that will require more than just her army. This means it's time to summon Midar the Dark Elf, which is always an absolute highlight of the show for me. He pops up out of the magic cup and seems in a bad mood. He says he is growing weary of Maeve's requests for help and offers her a single sentinel to augment her forces. Maeve says, no, that's not enough, and Midar throws an immediate tantrum that reminds me of a certain current head of state who resembles a Satsuma full of lumpy custard and spite. Maeve does what you always do with people like that, which is to butter him up and make out she's in awe of him. This goes down exceptionally well with Midar, who is instantly mollified and offers the full 4 Sentinels of Evil to support her attack. He summons them all by name: the Ice Lord, the Rock Wolf, the Sea Serpent, and the Lightning Bat. On the one hand, it's nice to see the familiar faces of evil, but on the other hand, the Sentinels have an uncanny knack of being in the worst action scenes in the entire show, and spoilers, this episode isn't going to do much to change that. We now cut back to Kells Castle, where Aideen is talking to the statue of Deidre and really hoping that Cahad will cure her condition so that she can go back to being the centre of attention again. It's not your fault, you're beautiful and clever and a great warrior, says Aideen, which is technically a backhanded compliment, although probably the nicest backhanded compliment you're going to come across. Aideen confesses that she just wants to be more like Deidre and then says this is all her fault. And at that exact moment, Rohan wanders in to do something that the script never specifies, but I'm guessing involved a masonry drill and a jar of lube. Aideen immediately distracts him from whatever shameful plan he had in mind, and he queries exactly what she meant when she said, "This is all my fault." Aideen confesses in a general rather than specific sense, and then tells Rohan it was all for him and she's going to fix things. She leaves, with Rohan following after, telling her to wait. Meanwhile, we're on the road with the forces of Temra and fixing a small plot hole. A warrior approaches General Torque and tells him that all the soldiers have been mobilised except for those that guard the castle. Torque very specifically tells him, no, I want you to mobilise those soldiers too, even if it means leaving the castle completely unprotected. This is obviously an insane thing to do, and literally the only reason for doing it is so that Aideen can break in more easily. It's like Lex Luthor specifically ordering his staff to remove all kryptonite from his evil villain lair for complicated reasons 2 panels before we see Superman ripping the door off its hinges. We do also need to check in with the Kingdom of Kells, and things aren't going very well at all. Cahad tells Conovar that he still can't break the curse, Ivar pops in to say Rohan has vanished, and a soldier rocks up to say Maeve's entire army is on the move. There's a small council of war where Angus tries to do his usual bravado by telling Conovar that it's P and Ivar who do all the real work anyway, so they'll definitely be able to save the day. It's clear his heart isn't in it though, and it's a lovely little detail. He's the flippant one, and he's trying to be flippant, but he can't quite overcome just how dire the situation is. When the flippant one can't manage to keep it up, you know that things are getting really serious. He and Ivar don their mystical armour and head out to have an awkward fight in a field with 4 sentinels. But before we get to that supremely awkward fight, we need to see how Aideen has been getting on. She's flown all the way to Maeve's castle in search of the antidote to the spell, and of course there's nary a guard in sight to get in her way. It looks like this is going to be smooth sailing, except that we're being treated to a surprise terrible CGI monster in this episode. A little Easter egg for the fans there. Aideen breaks into Maeve's big cupboard of magical tat, and along with the various potions and powders, there's a small but pleasantly ugly little CGI gargoyle sat on one of the shelves. As soon as Aideen grabs a jar of some kind of magic stuff, She realises the gargoyle has come to life and is now attacking her after the fashion of almost all CGI monsters in this show. It is, of course, breathing fireballs at her while remaining entirely stationary. I can't be too cross because it's only going to be in the show for a couple of minutes and it's actually a delightful little critter. I think some kind of flying attack would have been better. She could have been flying about, it could have been flying about. But this is definitely the set piece that is harmed least by sticking to the classic Mystic Knight tropes. It all looks pretty bad for Aideen, however. Cut back to the two remaining Mystic Knights, and having donned their armour, they immediately run into a field where they are treated to one of the Sentinel's classic incompetent ambushes, where they appear out of nowhere and then loudly announce their presence. The episode clearly shot its load with the rather good castle fight earlier because this is every bit as lethargic and clumsy as every other fight between the Sentinels and the Mystic Knights. They bring out the worst in each other, much like Ant and Dec. It's 4 against 2, and this leads to both Ivar and Angus getting disarmed, and it looks like they too are finished, and that's our cue for another cut back to Aideen this time. Although both these sequences are low energy, they gain something from being run simultaneously with jump cuts. It creates a degree of tension when you have these quite a few little mini cliffhangers at the end of each scene. Aideen is trying to pacify the gargoyle like it's a dog, which is sweet although notably ineffective. Fortunately, Rohan is here to save the day, having followed Aideen all the way to Maeve's castle. If the gargoyle wants Aideen, he'll have to come through Rohan, he says. Aideen, tangling with a gargoyle the same size as her, makes for a scary encounter. Rohan, tangling with that same gargoyle, comes across like someone drop-kicking a badger. He does at least beat the gargoyle in a fun way. The gargoyle chucks a fireball at him, and he does a proper baseball swing with his sword, and sends the fireball right back at the gargoyle, who promptly explodes. Aideen is saved, and they've got access to Maeve's big cupboard. Aideen makes some inappropriately horny noises to indicate that she is pleased and relieved to see him, and after a brief chat and another mea culpa from the fairy, they're going to be able to head back to Kells with a sack full of potentially helpful magic. Back in the field, miles away from anything, Ivar and Angus have remembered that as well as their magical weapons, they've also got battle gauntlets which shoot lasers, which we haven't seen since the early days of the show, and this makes for a nice callback because deploying additional lasers enables them to regain their weapons. But even so, it's still 2 against 4, and things seem less than ideal. Back at Kells Castle, Cahad has a very scientific approach to curing Deidre, which is to chuck random powders from Maeve's collection over the statue of Deidre to see if any of them help. If she ends up coming back with 2 heads or a nasty case of tennis elbow, he'll only have himself to blame. So far, none of the powders seem to be working, and things are looking bleak for Angus and Ivar. The 4 Sentinels have settled into their favourite combat formation, which is standing in a line and shooting lasers. Ivar takes a laser to the chest, and Angus is cowering behind some rocks, praying for a miracle. It seems unlikely, but almost immediately the Sentinels are knocked off their feet by a gust of wind. It's Rohan and a fully restored Deidre at last, all armoured up and able to join forces with Ivar and Angus. Turns out that 2 can play at the standing in a line shooting lasers game, and that's exactly how the battle reaches a theoretical climax, with 2 groups of 4 people standing opposite each other and firing lasers until there's some kind of magical explosion and the Sentinels disappear. It's a very lazy way to finish off the episode's main plot, but honestly, there's almost a nostalgia to seeing the Sentinels drag every segment they're in down. I'd feel genuinely shortchanged if there was a fight with the Sentinels and it actually looked something other than completely rubbish. The only thing left is a coda, in which Aideen demonstrates that she's learned a valuable lesson about life. Specifically, she's learned don't be a crazed stalker who tries to take out anyone who the object of your affections shows a romantic interest in. The important thing is that she's apologised and learned the error of her ways. She does look very chastened and uncomfortable, and it's a decent bit of acting from Kelly Campbell, who rarely has much of a chance to show her skills. Rohan insists that the one Aideen really needs to apologise to is Deidre. The script plays a blinder by having Deidre accept the apology from Aideen, but in a way that is both furious and threatening. Rather than meekly saying everything's fine, she tears a strip off Aideen, which is a lovely bit of character work, as it re-establishes the status quo of everyone being basically friends again, while still leading into Deidre's reputation for being quite the fiery-tempered one. It remains to be seen whether Aideen will have actually learned her lesson in future episodes, because problematically horny for Rohan is 90% of her character, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say she will be back to doing a big old stalking at the very first opportunity. That said, I really enjoyed this episode. There's an engaging mixture of the well thought out and the ham-fisted, but I think the most important thing is that it's fundamentally an episode driven by character work. Getting to see Aideen's obsession turn malignant made for the basis for a good story arc, and I did enjoy seeing Deidre be the one foregrounded as the unstoppable badass instead of Rohan for a change. Midar and Maeve's relationship gets a little bit more depth, with it being clear that each seems to think that they are cleverly using the other. All things considered, one of the better episodes, and a very well-paced episode for the most part. Next episode is called Battle of the Druids, which might even give Kahad a chance to shine for once. My fingers are crossed that when it says battle, what they actually mean is battle rap, and we're going to be treated to some of the very worst MCing that 90s children's television has to offer. Anyway, I can dream. Well, I hope you'll join me for it, whatever the Druid battle turns out to be. In the meantime, you can get in touch with me via email at hjdoomretrofun, or one word, gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. If you'd like to do me a solid favour, then a rating or review on your podcast app of choice would be hugely appreciated. This has been a production of Doom Industries. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.